She had been assigned to the rifle bay long before she ever thought of working alongside real operators, and most days it was quiet work that gave her mind time to drift even as her hands stayed busy on the well-practiced routine of checking stocks, wiping down barrels, and logging serial numbers into the battered clipboard that hung on the wall by the door. It wasn't glamorous, and the fluorescent lights above made everything look harsher than it was, but she liked the smell of oil and the quiet discipline the task demanded. Every weapon had to gleam, every bolt had to slide smooth, and every bay had to look ready in case someone walked in and expected to grab a rifle that could fire without hesitation. She was halfway through reassembling an M4, her fingers slick with the sheen of cleaning solvent, when she noticed the silence deepen behind her. Usually the men came in groups, loud voices, laughter, footsteps that echoed, but this was different. One presence, no sound, just stillness pressing into her back until she turned her head slightly and found a figure in dark fatigues standing a pace away. He didn't speak. He just held out the weapon like it was part of him, a long scarred rifle that looked as if it had been to hell and back. She froze for a heartbeat, eyes flicking from his face to the weapon and back again, but his expression gave nothing away, trained into calm like stone in water. For a moment she thought she should speak first, but then something about the way he simply extended it, not demanding, not careless but deliberate, made her just reach out and take it, her hands steady though her pulse had quickened. The weight surprised her. Heavier than the standard rifle she had been cycling through all morning, but balanced in a way that suggested it had been customized, lived in, carried for days without rest. She looked down at it and felt the silence stretch, and she realized he wasn't going to fill it with words. He wanted her to notice, to understand something. Her thumb brushed the stock, feeling the faint groove worn into it, not factory-made but carved by repetition, the same place a hand had gripped countless times. She glanced up again. His eyes were steady, watching not her face but her hands, as if to judge whether she respected the weapon the way he did. The air in the rifle bay thickened with unspoken expectation, and for once she didn't feel like just the armory tech who cleaned and cataloged. She felt tested. She began the routine. Checked the chamber, checked the safety, leaned in close to inspect the barrel. He still didn't speak, but she could feel the way his presence pressed against every movement she made, quiet but unrelenting. It made her meticulous, sharper, as though she was being graded on every second. The rifle itself told a story, pitted metal along the rail where salt water must have bitten it, faint discoloration at the muzzle from sand or dust baked in, tiny scratches along the receiver that no amount of cleaning would hide. It wasn't neglect, it was use, survival, proof of places she had only heard about in rumors. She found herself holding her breath as she worked, each stroke of the cloth over steel feeling more intimate than mechanical. The silence began to shift, not oppressive now but almost companionable, as though he was telling her without words. This is what matters, this is what endures, not the chatter of men outside or the paperwork that buried every requisition. When she finished, she handed it back to him with both hands instinctively, like she had seen soldiers in old documentaries do when returning a sword. He took it without breaking eye contact, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Approval or maybe recognition that she had understood what he hadn't said aloud. Then he gave a single nod, turned, and walked out as quietly as he had arrived, leaving her alone with the humming lights and the lingering weight of the exchange. She stood still, hands tingling, trying to understand why her chest felt tight, why a simple task suddenly carried the gravity of something larger. It wasn't just cleaning anymore. It wasn't just routine. It felt like initiation, like she had been wordlessly invited into a circle she didn't know she was ready for. She sat back down, but the other rifles waiting on the bench seemed smaller now, lighter, as though their stories were only practice while his weapon had carried real history. She picked up the next M4, but her mind kept returning to the silent seal and the way he had trusted her with his rifle without saying a single word. She didn't know his name, but she knew the message had been clear. Action spoke where words didn't, and respect wasn't granted, it was measured in silence. The next day she found herself walking into the rifle bay earlier than usual, almost restless, as if the silence from yesterday had never truly ended but only stretched overnight into her dreams where she replayed the weight of that weapon and the steady eyes that had watched her. She told herself it was just another day, another shift, another round of cleaning and logging, but there was a taut thread pulling at her focus, some expectation that maybe, just maybe, he would return. She set down her bag, tied back her hair, and began the routine with mechanical precision, yet every creak of the door, every footstep in the corridor made her glance up sharply before forcing her eyes back on the disassembled rifle parts in front of her. Hours passed and no one came, just the buzz of fluorescent lights and the familiar comfort of solvent and steel. By noon she convinced herself that yesterday had been an anomaly, a fleeting encounter never meant to repeat, and she tried to bury the restless curiosity gnawing at her ribs. But as she was reassembling the bolt carrier of a standard-issue rifle, the air shifted again, that same weight pressing behind her, and before she even turned she knew it was him. Her pulse quickened though her hands kept steady, forcing herself to finish the last click of the assembly before swiveling slightly in her chair. He was there, like before, silent, holding the same rifle though now she could tell it had been fired since yesterday. The faint smell of gunpowder lingered on it, sharp and undeniable, and for an instant she felt as though the walls of the bay had dissolved and he had stepped straight from some unseen battlefield into her small domain. He extended it again, silent, expectant, and she took it without hesitation this time, almost reverently, the familiarity from yesterday making the moment feel less strange yet no less heavy. As she began the cleaning process she noticed new marks on the weapon, a thin smear of dried mud along the magazine well, faint scratches at the stock as if it had been dragged over rock. Her mind tried to imagine where he had been, what circumstances had etched these fresh scars into metal, but she knew better than to ask. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was a shield, a deliberate choice that demanded she read the story in steel rather than in words. She cleaned carefully, slower than usual, as though afraid to erase details that might matter, but eventually the rhythm overtook her, cloth and brush moving with practiced familiarity until the weapon gleamed again. Throughout, he stood in the same position, arms loose but gaze unbroken, and the longer she worked the more she felt his presence shape her movements, turning routine into ceremony. When she finished she handed it back as before, both hands steady, and once again his eyes flickered with something like recognition. But this time instead of leaving immediately he stayed, still holding the rifle close, and for the first time he spoke. Just one word. Good. His voice was low, rough, carrying the edge of someone unused to wasting syllables, and the single word struck her harder than an entire speech might have. She nodded, unsure whether to respond, but he had already turned toward the door, vanishing as silently as yesterday, leaving her rooted in place with the echo of his voice vibrating in her chest. The word replayed itself over and over, not just a compliment but a verdict, proof that her hands and her respect had been acknowledged by someone who measured worth in silence and necessity. She sat there long after he left, staring at the bench of weapons that suddenly looked less like tools and more like messages waiting to be interpreted. She realized she wanted him to return again, not out of curiosity alone but because his presence transformed the work, gave it weight and meaning beyond routine. She thought of telling someone, maybe a friend from logistics or one of the other techs, but the idea dissolved immediately. This wasn't something to share. It was private, a wordless understanding between two people who existed on opposite ends of experience yet had met in the ritual of steel and oil. That night, lying awake in her narrow bunk, she felt the phantom weight of his rifle still in her hands, and she knew that if he came again she would not just clean, she would listen, not to words, but to silence that spoke louder than anything else. She told herself she wouldn't wait for him but her body betrayed her as the following days turned into quiet anticipation, every motion of her hands precise but tinged with expectation. Every sound outside the rifle bay interpreted as the herald of his return, and though she tried to bury it beneath discipline she could not deny that her mind now measured time by whether he appeared or not. When the door finally opened again the third time, it was not silent footsteps but the heavy scrape of boots across the concrete floor, and when she turned she saw him not only with the rifle but with a second weapon slung across his back, a sidearm holstered at his thigh, his gear dusted with the faint grime of recent use. He placed the rifle on the table without preamble, the same scarred one she had already come to know, but instead of stepping back he unstrapped the sidearm and set it beside it, then folded his arms across his chest as if to say, "Show me what you can do." Her throat tightened but her hands reached out, lifting the pistol first, weighing it, recognizing the familiar but personalized modifications. Rubberized grip worn smooth, slide etched with tiny nicks from countless holstering motions. She field stripped it carefully, the click and clatter of parts loud against the hush between them, and as she cleaned she felt his gaze like gravity on the back of her neck. When she reassembled it, the pieces locked back together with a satisfying snap that echoed with finality. She placed it neatly beside the rifle and turned to the larger task, her fingers now moving with the confidence of repetition but her heart thudding with the awareness that this was no longer just maintenance. It was demonstration, an unspoken exam that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the bay. As she worked she found her eyes tracing the new scars on the rifle, fresh dents near the magazine housing, a smear of rust beginning where salt had not yet been wiped away, and she wondered where he had carried it, what corners of the world had pressed their story into the steel since she had last touched it. She wanted to ask but did not, sensing that questions would shatter the fragile, deliberate ritual between them. Instead she let her movements be her voice, cleaning with precision, inspecting with respect, and when she finished she placed the weapon back in his waiting hands without hesitation. He studied her for a moment longer than usual, then gave a short nod and finally spoke again, this time 2 words, "You learn." His voice was the same, low, steady, roughened with something more than time, but those 2 words struck deeper than the first, pulling a heat to her chest that surprised her. She almost smiled but stopped herself, simply bowing her head slightly, and he accepted that as response. Without another word he turned and left once more, but the silence he left behind was no longer empty. It buzzed with the weight of progress, as though a door she hadn't known existed was now open just a crack. She realized she wasn't only waiting for him anymore, she was changing because of him. The rifles and pistols she handled after his departure didn't feel like routine stock anymore but like practice, preparation for the next time he would appear, each motion sharpening her, teaching her patience, focus, and a respect she hadn't known she could feel so strongly. At night her dreams filled with images of weapons she had never held, places she had never been, and always his silent figure at the center, watching, judging, acknowledging. She woke each morning sharper, hungrier, her work infused with a new intensity, until even her colleagues noticed her precision had shifted, her eyes keener, her posture straighter. They asked her what had changed and she only shrugged, unwilling to reveal the truth of the silent lessons happening in the rifle bay. She understood now that whatever this was, it wasn't simply about cleaning weapons. It was about understanding the weight of them, the stories carved into their surfaces, the trust implicit in being allowed to hold what another carried through life and death. And each time she remembered his words, first good, then you learn, she felt as if she had been marked, chosen not by ceremony or declaration but by silence sharpened into truth. The 4th time he came was different, and she knew it the moment the door opened, not because of his footsteps but because of the heaviness that walked in with him, a silence thicker than usual, weighted by something raw that clung to him like shadow, and when he set the rifle on the table this time it was not just scarred but battered, the kind of wear that spoke of a night longer than days, of a mission that had demanded everything and given nothing back. The metal darkened with soot, the stock flecked with something that looked like dried earth but smelled faintly of iron, and she felt her breath catch as she reached for it, her hands steady by will alone. He stood closer than before, not at a measured distance but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his presence, and when she dared glance up she saw his eyes not stone still but carrying a shadow of exhaustion, an echo of something heavy he refused to voice. She didn't ask, couldn't ask because his silence was sacred, but she knew in that moment that the rifle carried more than scratches and dents, it carried the unspoken weight of what he had endured. She worked with more care than ever, not only cleaning but almost tending to it like it was wounded, her cloth slow, deliberate, every stroke a promise of respect. Her fingers traced the worn grip, the chipped rail, the faint groove deepened since she had last seen it, and she wondered how many times in the last hours his hand had clung to it, how many moments depended on the barrel she now wiped clean. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the closeness made her pulse drum in her ears, and though the silence was as sharp as ever it felt more intimate now, as if he had brought her into his orbit more fully than before, showing her not only the weapon but himself in fragments carved into steel. When she handed it back, both hands steady but her chest tight, he accepted it without the faintest hesitation, but instead of nodding or leaving, he lingered, his gaze fixed on her as though measuring something deeper than her skill. The air vibrated with words unspoken, and she felt herself held in that gaze until he finally said 3 words, his voice low but edged with a weight that made her skin prickle. "You understand now." She swallowed hard, unsure if she did, but the conviction in his tone told her that he believed it, and that mattered more than her doubts. She nodded once, unable to speak, and he gave the faintest curve of his mouth, not a smile exactly, but the closest she had seen to softness, before turning away, leaving her with the echo of those words pulsing in the walls of the bay. She sat down slowly, her legs weak, staring at the bench cluttered with rifles that suddenly seemed ordinary, lifeless, compared to the one she had just tended, and she realized she was beginning to crave not just his presence but the meaning that came with it, the way his silence transformed the mundane into something profound. That night she couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the words, "You understand now," over and over, trying to decide if it was a declaration, a warning, or an invitation, and she felt restless until dawn pulled her back into the rifle bay, where she buried herself in work just to feel the rhythm of steel and oil anchor her again. Each click, each swipe, each gleam of restored metal reminded her of him, and though she told herself this was dangerous, that she was treading into a place she didn't belong, She could not deny that the ritual had become the center of her days, the silent exchange carving itself deeper into her. She knew he would come again, and when he did she would be ready, not just with steady hands but with a heart that had begun to align itself with the quiet, deliberate weight of his world. She told herself she would not let anticipation control her. Yet each morning as she unlocked the rifle bay and stepped inside the familiar scent of oil and metal, her body carried a quiet tension, as if tuned to a frequency that only activated when he arrived, and when days passed without him she felt hollow, as though something vital had been withheld. But when the door finally opened again it was without ceremony, no heaviness this time, no exhaustion, just his silent presence filling the room like a returning tide. He carried not only his scarred rifle but also a case, a long black container he set carefully on the table before sliding it toward her, his eyes steady, his face unreadable, and though her hands itched to open it she hesitated, looking up at him for permission. He gave the slightest nod, and she unclasped the latches, lifting the lid to reveal a sniper rifle unlike any she had handled before, sleek yet worn, its length whispering of patience and precision, its surfaces etched with scratches that mapped stories she could not guess. She felt her breath catch, not because it was beautiful but because she could sense immediately that this was not just a weapon. It was an extension of him, a part of his silence, a tool that had lived in the shadows where words had no place. She reached out, running her fingers lightly along the barrel before beginning the ritual of disassembly, her motions careful, reverent, knowing he was watching more closely than ever. The weapon told its own story in small details, the faint burnishing along the scope where his eye had pressed countless times, the subtle darkening of the grip where his hand had shaped it, the marks at the muzzle from nights spent in dust or rain. She cleaned each piece slowly, her breath measured, her heartbeat thudding in her ears, and though the silence was the same it felt different now, charged, as if she had been invited into a secret far deeper than before. He didn't speak, but she felt words all around her, woven into the air, into the steel she held, and by the time she reassembled the rifle and set it gently back into the case, her hands trembled not from fear but from the weight of understanding that this was more than trust. It was initiation into a world few ever touched. He studied her as she closed the lid, his gaze unrelenting, and for a moment she thought he might finally explain, but instead he gave one of his almost smiles, the faintest curve of his mouth, before placing his hand briefly on the case as though to acknowledge her part in it. Then he spoke, voice rough, quiet but firm, "Respect keeps you alive." 4 words, simple, but they slammed into her like a tide, and she nodded without hesitation, her throat too tight to answer aloud. He lifted the case, slung his rifle back over his shoulder, and left as silently as ever, yet the echo of his words reverberated through her chest long after he was gone. That night she could not shake them, could not push aside the feeling that her life had tilted onto a new axis, that the work she once saw as routine was now something sacred, and though she lay awake staring at the ceiling, exhaustion pressing at her, her mind returned again and again to his voice. Respect keeps you alive. She thought about what he meant, about how his silence had always demanded respect not just for the weapon but for what it represented, the weight of choices, the lives taken, the lives saved, and she realized that he wasn't just teaching her about cleaning rifles. He was teaching her how to see the world through his lens, sharp, quiet, unforgiving. When she finally drifted into restless sleep, her dreams were filled with the glint of scopes, the hum of silence, and always his steady eyes watching, testing, waiting for her to prove herself again. She arrived earlier than usual the next day, almost before dawn, as if her body no longer trusted her mind to be casual about the rhythm of these encounters. And though she told herself she was only there to prepare the bay for another routine cycle of inspections, her hands betrayed her by laying out tools with unnecessary precision, arranging cloths, solvents, and brushes like an altar for something sacred. And when the door finally creaked open she did not startle but simply looked up, already knowing it would be him. This time he entered without his usual silence cloaked in mystery. Instead he looked like a storm contained in flesh, jaw tight, eyes shadowed by something deeper than exhaustion, his movements sharp and deliberate, and when he placed the rifle on the table it was almost a challenge, the metal scarred more than she had ever seen, blackened around the barrel, the smell of spent rounds still clinging like ghost smoke. She reached for it without hesitation, though her heart hammered, and as her fingers closed around the stock she felt not just the weight of steel but the echo of violence it had endured only hours before, and she knew in her bones that lives had been taken with it since she last touched it. Her hands worked with calm precision, breaking it down, wiping each piece until the soot lifted and the faint gleam returned, and with every motion she felt him watching, not testing this time but almost as if he needed to see her work, needed the quiet ritual to ground him. She didn't speak. Couldn't, because the air between them pulsed too heavy with whatever unspoken battle he carried, and though she burned with questions, she knew silence was her role, her offering, her way of giving him something words could never provide. When she finished and reassembled the rifle, she handed it back like always, both palms steady beneath the weight, but instead of taking it immediately he let his hands linger on hers, rough skin brushing her fingers, not intentional intimacy but a pause that carried more power than a touch meant to comfort. His eyes locked on hers, steady but storm-dark, and finally he said 5 words that rooted themselves into her chest like anchors: "Steel remembers more than men." The sentence struck her harder than any lecture ever had, and though she didn't fully understand it, she felt its truth, felt how the weapon in her hands carried memories no human could bear forever, scars etched into metal that told stories even silence could not erase. He pulled the rifle from her grasp then, slinging it against his shoulder, and though he looked as if he might leave like always, he stopped at the door and glanced back, his gaze softer now, as if acknowledging that she had given him something he hadn't known he needed. The room seemed to hum after he left, the smell of oil and steel wrapping around her like smoke, and she sat down heavily, her breath shaking, her mind replaying his words again and again. Steel remembers more than men. She thought about the rifles stacked in neat rows along the walls, every one of them a library of unspoken memory, and she realized with sudden clarity that she had been treating them as objects when in truth they were witnesses, repositories of choices, carriers of echoes left behind by those who held them. That night she wrote the sentence on a scrap of paper and tucked it into her pocket, needing it close, needing to feel the truth of it pressed against her as she moved through the day, and when she slept she dreamed not of him this time but of countless weapons lined up like voices in the dark, whispering in steel, waiting for hands that would either honor or forget. She didn't count the days anymore, didn't measure time in shifts or meals, only in the rhythm of when he came and when he didn't. And though she kept up the routine for everyone else who passed through the bay, it was only when he walked in that her heartbeat sharpened. Her hands steadied with that strange mixture of reverence and hunger that had come to define these silent lessons. When he appeared this time his presence felt different, not storm-heavy or battle-worn but purposeful, as if he had come not just to leave another scarred weapon in her hands but to give her something more, and when he set the rifle on the table he also removed a knife from his belt, laying it beside the steel with careful precision, the blade dark with use and the hilt worn smooth from years of grip. She stared at it for a moment, pulse loud in her ears, before reaching out to take it, and as her fingers closed around the handle she felt the history it carried, heavier in its way than any firearm. Cleaning it was simple, far simpler than the rifles, but as she worked she realized it wasn't about the process. It was about seeing, about feeling, about understanding that even tools designed for silence had voices if one listened close enough. He watched her with that same steady intensity, arms folded, eyes unblinking, and when she finished polishing the blade and set it gently back on the cloth, he nodded once, the small gesture weighted with acknowledgement. Then he spoke again, his voice like gravel dragged over stone. "Every mark has a cost." 4 words, plain, but they crawled under her skin and stayed there, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she thought of every scratch, every dent, every dark line etched into the steel and the blade, each one a story untold but real nonetheless. She wanted to ask him what his own cost had been, what toll his silence had taken, but she knew better, knew that his silence was not a wall but a lesson, and that if he wanted her to know, he would show her in the same way he always did, with steel, with scars, with silence that spoke louder than explanation. He took the knife back, slid it into its sheath and collected the rifle, but instead of turning to leave he stepped closer, so near she could see the fine lines etched into his face, the weathering of sun and shadow, the faint scar that curved along his jaw like a story half told. For the first time she realized how human he looked beneath the weight of his silence, not untouchable but marked, as fragile in his way as the steel he carried, and it made her chest ache with a strange mixture of respect and something deeper she didn't want to name. He looked at her then, truly looked, and said another sentence, low, deliberate: "Silence can be loyalty." The words struck her in a different way, not about weapons but about them, about this fragile, wordless bond they had built in the humming light of the rifle bay, and though she didn't respond aloud, her eyes held his and in that moment she knew he had seen her answer. Then as always he turned and left, his footsteps fading, but this time she didn't feel emptiness in his absence. She felt the hum of something alive, something binding, and she knew now that whatever had begun as routine cleaning had grown into a ritual that belonged only to them. That night as she lay awake in the quiet of her bunk she repeated his words to herself. Every mark has a cost, silence can be loyalty, and she realized she was no longer just learning about weapons, no longer just serving in the background. She was being shaped, honed, transformed by a man who spoke rarely but whose silence had become the sharpest voice in her life, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be the same again. When he returned again, it was different from all the other times, not in the way he moved or the silence he carried but in the gravity that seemed to fill the room before he even set foot inside. And when he finally appeared in the doorway, she felt the shift instantly, her breath catching as though she already knew this encounter would not be like the rest. He walked in with his rifle slung across his back, the case she remembered from before in one hand, but there was no weariness in him this time, no exhaustion or storm shadowing his eyes. Instead there was clarity, a deliberate steadiness, as if he had already decided what must happen. He placed the case on the table, slid it toward her, then removed the rifle from his shoulder and laid it beside it, followed by the knife, until the surface of the bench was filled with the three objects that had become symbols of their silent bond. She looked at them, then at him, heart pounding with a rhythm she couldn't control, and though her hands twitched with the instinct to begin the ritual, she held back, sensing this was not only about cleaning anymore. His gaze met hers, steady, unyielding, and then he spoke, his voice as quiet as ever but carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the air. "You've learned enough." The words struck her harder than any others, a declaration that sounded final, and her throat tightened as she reached for the rifle anyway, breaking it down, cleaning each part with the same meticulous care she had always shown, her hands steady though her chest burned with the ache of what those words might mean. He watched, silent once more, and though his eyes revealed nothing, she felt something shifting in the space between them, as though the silence was no longer a test but a farewell. When she finished, she reassembled the weapon, handed it back as always, both palms open beneath its weight, and this time he took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers not by accident but with intention, lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he set it aside and gestured for her to open the case. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing the sniper rifle again, but this time there was no soot, no grime, no scars fresh from battle. It gleamed as if already cleaned, ready, perfect. She stared at it in confusion until she realized he was watching her, waiting, and when she looked back into his eyes she understood. This wasn't about cleaning it. This was about her holding it, about him placing into her hands something that had always been an extension of him. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the rifle from its case, the weight familiar yet new, heavier because of what it meant. She held it steady, her fingers brushing the worn grip where his had rested countless times, her cheek almost lowering toward the stock before she stopped herself, unwilling to cross a line without his command. He stepped closer then, so close she could feel his presence like heat, and with a calmness that made her heart lurch he guided her hands into position, adjusting the rifle until it fit against her body the way it was meant to, the way it had fit him. His touch was firm but patient, his silence louder than any words, and when he finally stepped back she felt the weight of the rifle differently, not as his but as theirs, a symbol of the wordless trust that had been built stroke by stroke, scar by scar, silence by silence. She lowered it back into the case, closed the lid and looked at him, waiting, her breath caught in her chest. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied her with eyes that seemed to pierce through every layer of her, until finally he spoke, voice low, steady, final, "You'll carry it forward." She didn't know if he meant the lessons, the silence, the respect, or something more, but she nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes though she held them back, unwilling to break the strength of the moment. He lifted the case, slung his rifle across his back, adjusted the knife at his belt, and gave her one last look, a look that held approval, respect, and something else she could never name but would remember for the rest of her life. Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps fading into the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the humming light of the rifle bay, her hands still tingling with the weight of what had just passed. She sat down slowly, staring at the empty table, and for the first time she realized the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, filled with meaning, filled with him. And as she laid her hands flat on the steel surface she whispered the words she had never dared speak before, not to him but to the air itself, knowing they would remain etched in the silence like every scar etched into steel. Respect keeps you alive. The end.